I'm Mike with Credo Outdoors, and today we are going to butcher the front shoulder of a mature boar that we harvested a couple days ago in the mountains. So the first thing I notice about the front shoulder of a bear versus the front shoulder of any other animals that we've killed over the past years is the sheer size of the biceps and triceps, which is that muscle and this muscle on you, as well as the forearm. If you compare that to a deer or an elk or another ungulate, this part of the front shoulder is very, very small, very little meat comes off of it. However, the shoulder blade is bulbous and big, and we have our flat iron steak, what sometimes is referred to as the petite tenderloin up here, which is the supraspinatus area. Still some debate amongst our group as to what we actually are calling that. But with this bear, it's completely different. We have a small amount of meat actually on the shoulder blade itself, so that's right here on y'all, but very, very large arms, very large forearms. So this is going to make great ossobuco or birria or anything else, and if we can manage to keep the meat on that bone, that'll make a great bone-in roast, crock pot, etc. Now, with that being said, all bear meat actually tastes wonderful ground. It makes amazing burger, it makes amazing sausage. It has a slight fruity flavor to it, and that's in part due to its fall-time diet of berries and other plants that have that flavor to it, and the meat actually imparts that. So what we're going to do with this shoulder right now is I am going to remove all of the meat off the shoulder blade in one fell swoop and make a big shoulder blade roast in its entirety, and then we're going to work our way down to the biceps and triceps or the upper arm of the bear, and finally we're going to leave the forearm or the shank as a whole to make some ossobuco, to make a birria, to make anything you want with that bone-in shank. With that being said, again, you can take all of this off and throw it in grind, and it's going to be some of the best ground meat that you can possibly have. So before I get started on that, some generalized anatomy. What we have noticeable here is the elbow of this animal, okay? So this animal's elbow is facing this way, and it's looking like to my left. How do I know it's looking to the left? Because there's a concave side to the shoulder and a convex side to this shoulder blade. The concave side actually faces the inside of the animal. So this is going to be lateral, or the outside of the animal. The body of the animal is going to be right here, and it's going to be facing that way with its head about right here. And I know that because of the concavity of that shoulder blade. So I'm going to start my cut with my argali knife at the junction where the biceps and triceps meets that shoulder blade, and I'm simply going to keep my knife down along the bone, not cutting into the bone, but rather almost filleting the meat off of the bone all the way around this shoulder blade, making a nice big sheet of meat that can be folded on itself, put in a crock pot, cut into smaller pieces before freezing, whatever you choose. I'm not so worried with this front shoulder about keeping the meat and the muscle groups separate, knowing that I am doing a big sheet of meat like this. However, I do want to get it all off in one fell swoop. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And if that means cutting through the belly of the meat at some points, that's okay. So I'm on that medial aspect, and I'm simply working my way back to the shoulder joint, which we can see and know is right here. So I'm going to work this back, flip it over the top, and then work it off of the lateral side of that shoulder. Another option that you have with the shoulder blade is to actually make blade-in roast or bone-in blade roast. And to do that, you're probably going to want a meat saw, or a bone saw rather, and you're going to simply portion the meat where you want and then saw it into pieces and make nice 4 to 5 pound bone-in blade roast. So I'm not touching my knife down actually into the bone. I'm shaving the meat off of the bone, if you will. So I'm near the very edge of that bone now, and I don't want to go too far because I want to keep this as one nice full sheet of meat. So I'm going to spin that, and as I've said before, just like when you're in the field dressing an animal and you need to be dynamic using your arms and your legs and what to hold those legs so you can get better cuts, you need to be dynamic when you're butchering. Sometimes your piece of meat is so large that you have to be able to move around it, making sure that the knife blade is always facing away from you. You're not going to cut into your fingers or anything else. We're fortunate enough with this animal that I'm able to actually move it around to create that dynamic atmosphere to get the best cuts that I possibly can. So I'm over the top of that blade at this point. And now I'm going to work my way down the lateral portion of that blade. Again, just shaving the meat off of the blade. Any meat that's left on this after you're finished, it's totally okay because it is fantastic ground on its own. So what I'm doing here is removing the meat that is right here above the biceps. So here we have the biceps and triceps. I'm removing this meat that's down around the triceps, but I'm not cutting into the triceps themselves. Right down along the angle of that bone, keeping my knife in contact with the bone to get as much of that meat off as I possibly can. I'm going to go ahead and loosen it from its point of contact here. And work my way up. Now, one of our favorite cuts of meat actually on the shoulder is the flat iron steak. Unfortunately, at least on this bear, it's not very large. So it's going to end up in this boneless blade roast that we're getting right now. The flat iron steak is located when you put the meat back on and you're able to find that spinous process or the spine of the scapula. The flat iron steak is the infraspinatus muscle that's right there. But again, on this bear, it's very, very small. So we're going to include it in the boneless blade roast. Almost finished taking it all the way off. Always keeping track where the tip of the knife is so I don't end up with a cut finger or anything else. The only thing I want to actually cut is the meat. I'm going to go ahead and work my way down and remove this upper part of the bicep and include that in this roast as well. Cutting straight down to the bone and then moving it backwards. Gently touching the knife to the bone. I'm not actually cutting into the bone itself, but I'm making sure the knife blade at some level is in contact with the bone so I can get as much meat off of that as I can. I'm really trying to have what I refer to as shaving the meat off the bone. So we have almost all of that removed at this point. Flip over one last time. Get in here. I'm using the weight of the meat to my advantage and just touching the bone with the tip of the knife and letting the weight of the meat pull it off. We're at the head of that humerus, which is the arm bone that connects to the shoulder blade. Coming down. All we have to do now is articulate that wonderful sheet of meat off of there. our scapula, and a nice boneless blade roast. Now you can cut this into smaller portions, put it into a crock pot, make a nice bear stew out of it. You can make pulled meat for pulled tacos, barbecued sandwiches, whatever you want to do with it. What we're going to do prior to putting it in the freezer is go in and trim some of the silver skin and some of the fat off of it. But for the most part, in a pressure cooker or a crock pot over the course of pressure cooker, 3 hours, crock pot, 8 to 12 hours, all of that is going to cook down and it's going to add to the flavor of the meat. Now moving on to the rest of the upper limb. What I'm going to do is remove the remainder of the tricep and the bicep. I'm going to remove this humerus, and that's that muscle right here, or that is that bone right here. And we're going to keep the forearm as a shank. Notice that there's a lot of musculature on the forearm, but there's not a lot of length. Bears are not overly tall animals, but they are extremely musculature. They have a lot of muscles. They have to use their claws and their arms to dig into things. So we're going to keep that to put as ossobuco, crock pot, whatever you want. So all I'm doing to remove the rest of this bicep and tricep from the humerus is locating the humerus, just like I did with the boneless blade roast, and I'm shaving it off of the humerus, getting as much of the meat as I possibly can. What I'm going to do with this meat that I'm cutting off of this bone is goes into the grind pile. I know we don't advocate grinding much meat, but I wouldn't tell you that it is a great thing to do with your bear if it truly wasn't delicious in and of itself in that manner. So all I'm doing is finding where that muscle meets the other muscles, and I'm cutting it. Cutting right down along that humerus to the elbow, cutting down off the elbow. I'm going to put that in the grind, and then I'm going to move the elbow around. Notice that I have some of those forearm muscles. This is actually muscle right here. When it contracts, it lifts the bear's paw upward, so it has to connect to the humerus and down here. So I'm going to remove that attachment point. I'm going to locate where this humerus, and I can start to see it right now, comes into the elbow, and I'm going to take my knife and cut all those ligaments and everything else and remove it. So right now I'm removing those muscles of the forearm that actually attach to the humerus. And while I'm doing that, I'm not going to let any of that animal go to waste. I'm taking those little bits of meat that are still on it off for the grind. So what I'm able to see now is where that meets up, and I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to cut into that joint. So what I'm doing is I'm using my fingers to articulate and feel where that bone comes into the ulna, and I'm able to find that, and when I find it, I stick my knife down into it and I try to cut those connections. Instead of just blindly hacking away and going after it, I'm actually trying to make informed decisions on where I'm cutting. So I can see this bone right here. That is from the forearm, and the humerus goes all the way around like that. So I'm going to take my knife and work all that out so all of that muscle actually stays on the shank. Because again, I want to preserve that shank so that we're able to make a nice ossobuco, bria, whatever we choose with that. Unfortunately, there's no secret or special way or quick hack to be able to figure out how to remove bones from each other and separate bones from each other. If there was, I would let you know. It's really a matter of taking your time, feeling for the articulation point of those bones, and just slowly working your way over to it so you can eventually break it with your own hands. Take your knife, cut the cartilage that holds it together, and end up with a really nice shank to cook how you please. So from that front shoulder, we have an absolutely enormous and beautiful boneless blade roast with a lot of muscle and a lot of delicious meat. It can be cooked multiple ways. We have a shank, slow cook, smoke and then braise, however you want to do it. And we have a little bit of ground. With that being said, maybe you want to do this with one of the shoulders from the bear you harvest, and then the other shoulder you want to commit to the grind pile so you have some meat for sausage, for burgers, for whatever.